Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on restoring Michigan's black tern population. My name is Andy Heinickel. I'm the Senior Manager of Conservation at Audubon Great Lakes. I'm going to be joined today by Kylie McElrath and Jenny Fuller from our office. Nicole, could you advance the slides? I'm also going to be joined by several of our partners today, including Joe Kaplan, Cameron Dole, and Amy Bear, who are going to talk a little bit about the work happening on the ground around Michigan. So today we're going to be talking about the charismatic black tern. This is a once common species now in steep decline. We're going to be talking about the efforts to protect it, the efforts to understand it, and work going on around Michigan. We're going to have time at the end for a 15-minute Q&A session. So we can put questions in chat and hear from you all on what you think about this and get you some feedback. Before we dive in, a little background on Audubon. So Audubon Great Lakes is the regional program of the National Audubon Society. Our office is headquartered in Chicago with staff around the basin. Our work covers Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and parts of New York. For those unfamiliar with the region, which I'm guessing most of you are, the Great Lakes are one of America's most important and often overlooked natural features. The region's home to 350 species of breeding birds. 35 million people live in the watershed itself. There are 35,000 acres of islands, 10,500 miles of shoreline. The area is 12,000 years old and represents 84% of North America's fresh surface water. Before I hand it over to our speakers today, I thought it might be valuable just to take a step back and briefly touch on how this work fits into Audubon's larger national strategy. Audubon has 5 strategic priorities nationwide: coasts, working lands, water, bird-friendly communities, and climate. The work we're talking about today primarily nests underneath the water strategy, which focuses on ensuring clean and abundant water in landscapes where it is paramount to birds' survival. To do that, we connect science, policy, advocacy to provide measurable and scalable impact for birds and the people utilizing the areas around the Great Lakes. In doing this, Audubon is creating a cohesive strategy across the region to address these threats to the birds of the Great Lakes. From 30,000 feet, our Great Lakes program looks to improve water quality, stabilize declining bird population by restoring and protecting the habitat they depend on. To inform this effort, and utilizing data from the coastal wetland monitoring program, such as the amount of coastal vegetation, presence absence data for 14 priority species, our national science staff ranked wetlands at 100-meter resolution within 30 kilometers of the shoreline. This ranking prioritized locations based on their importance to secretive marsh birds and other species, using the sites as migratory stopover. The fine scale resolution of this modeling allowed us to be more effective in our project planning and management. The prioritization resulted in the selection of 12 coastal wetland regions, which you see on the screen here, where Audubon is working to restore habitat that directly influence habitat restorations and management through our partners. So we're not doing it all ourselves, but we're working closely with many partners around the region to implement change at scale. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers. And first off today, we're going to have Jenny Fuller, our Senior Coordinator of Quantitative Science, to tell you a little bit more about the black tern. Jenny?
Great. Thank you, Andy. So I'll be kicking us off with a little introduction of black terns, their life history, and why we're focused on their conservation. So black terns, they're a small migratory shorebird, and they're the second smallest species of terns. So they're just around 9 to 10 inches in length, just a little bit smaller than a robin. They nest in freshwater wetlands in the Great Lakes, and their diet consists mainly of fish and insects. And a little fun fact about black terns is, unlike other terns that dive for their food, they'll actually swoop through the air to catch their prey. And they're a really large focus of conservation due to their declining populations, which I'll speak to more in a moment. But another reason is because they really need high quality, healthy wetlands. And so by working to improve their habitats, we not only help them, but we in turn improve the habitat for many other birds, wildlife, and improve services that are provided by these areas like flood control and water quality. So this is a really fun video showing their nesting. And so I'll talk a little bit about their nesting too. So this is one of 3 other terns that exclusively nest in freshwater marshes. So they congregate in somewhat dispersed groups or colonies, and they'll typically breed between May and July. They'll co-parent to incubate eggs for 21 days and raise up to 3 chicks. And their nests are floating, so they're usually composed of mats of cattail, reeds, or muck mounds of sedges or water lily. And we took this video through a scope at our Wigwam Bay site on Saginaw Bay, where many of the nests are composed of water lily muck mats. And this nest here has 3 adorable chicks, which are just a few days old. And as you can see, they're already very mobile, and they're very well camouflaged in their environment. You can hop to the next slide. So black terns are also a migratory bird, so they lead a bit of a dual life. So they'll nest in freshwater wetlands in the Great Lakes, as well as the prairie pothole region up in the northern parts of Canada, northwestern areas. And they'll spend their winter months along the coast of South and Central America. So to the right, we have the status and trends animation from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that shows their weekly abundance throughout the year. And then on the next slide, we can see towards the end of the breeding season, their migratory patterns. So adults will start to molt out of their black breeding plumage into more of a mottled cookies and cream pattern. And then their fledged chicks will join them on their fall journey south. So to the right, we have tracks from the Black Tern fall migration featured on Audubon's Bird Migration Explorer, which I highly recommend checking out. This data was collected using different tracking tools like MODIS and geolocators by our partners and our team in the Great Lakes. In the next slide. But unfortunately, black terns have experienced some really severe population declines in the Upper Great Lakes and the prairie pothole regions between the mid-1960s through the late 2000s. And in Michigan alone, this population fell 7.6% annually from 1966 to 2019. And so currently this species is listed as endangered in all the Great Lakes states except for Michigan, where it has recently been listed as state threatened. And so as a result of these declines, the Upper Mississippi and Great Lakes Joint Venture have also listed this species as a species of high conservation concern. So the reasons for this are not entirely clear, but we do know that black terns prefer these really large, high-quality wetlands. And unfortunately, more than half of these wetlands in the Great Lakes watershed have been lost or degraded, which really plays an important factor. And so because such a large portion of the Great Lakes black terns nest in Michigan, this state is a major focus for our ongoing monitoring and wetland restoration, as well as this webinar. Next slide. So our work at Audubon seeks to improve black tern populations and productivity in the Great Lakes and beyond. So to do this, we need to identify what threatens their productivity and their survival and how we can monitor for these over time, and then use that data to better manage species conservation. The next slide. And so now I'll give us some context of where we work and how our colonies are doing in the state. Next slide, sorry. So our largest collective monitoring effort was our statewide survey in Michigan, and where we reviewed as many historical black tern colonies as possible just to see if they're still occupied by breeding black terns. And we were actually able to collect data at 92 out of 93 historical breeding sites through a combination of volunteer and partner monitoring and eBird supplementary data. And 83 sites were surveyed by partners or Audubon Great Lakes volunteers, and 11 sites that we could not get to were supplemented with recent eBird data. So this was all done between 2021 and 2023. And so of these 92 sites, we confirmed presence or breeding activity at 67 of them. So I just want to mention we're incredibly grateful to our volunteers and over 8 different external partners who are essential to monitoring this vast number of sites. As someone who's surveyed some of these sites, I can really attest to how much hard work it is. It's a lot of blazing hot sun, pushing through reeds to get around, and just spending a ton of time and energy just to find these colonies in very remote places oftentimes. And we really couldn't have done this without a lot of really dedicated folks on the ground to get a pulse on black tern populations in the region. All right, next slide. So in addition to the statewide survey, we had 8 sites with in-depth monitoring. So this means any combination of banding, remotus tracking, nest checks, and camera monitoring, which has been really essential for determining the nest fate and potential threats that we might be able to address. And cameras especially have become a priority for our monitoring efforts. And our partner Joe will talk more later on about the importance of integrating these into our work to get more informative data with less disturbance to the birds. Next slide. And we also have 4 sites where habitat restoration is taking place, primarily by removing invasive cattail or common reed. Black terns prefer more of a 50-50 ratio of vegetation and open water, and invasive species can really upset this balance, crowding out the usable nesting habitat. They can also take up wetland space that might otherwise be composed of native species that they prefer. If we hop to the next slide, we can see an example of a wetland area dominated by invasive common reed. These images kind of illustrate the dense wall of vegetation that they can create, and also the lack of just that robust nesting material, even during high water years. The next slide. And so here are some examples of the preferred black tern habitat. So to the left, we have an area dominated by bulrush and a bulrush nest to that bottom left, and then a sedge and water lily dominated habitat at our wigwam site with the associated nest at the bottom there. And you can see how robust they are. They're ready to brave the elements. And both of these habitats are more likely to generate this robust nesting material and more dispersed vegetation as well, rather than habitat that's just too dense or unable to create enough floating mats for them to nest on. So speaking of floating nests, there are currently 3 sites where we're testing out ways to support black terns with supplementary nesting platforms. And we expect to see this increase to new sites as well. These are really helpful in areas that are threatened by storms, rapid water level changes, wave action, or periodic losses in nesting material due to different environmental conditions like water levels and ice cover. Next slide. And these are the different designs that our volunteers, partners, and international connections have developed. We have some canvas designs at St. Clair Flats that mimic that flexibility and flotation and the height of natural materials. They've been really well received by black terns in the past couple of years. There's also been PVC foam designs, smaller, more lightweight, that have been really successful in the Upper Peninsula. And we're also connected with researchers in the Netherlands, where there are the European black terns, who've been really successful in implementing their own wooden platform design with predator exclosures for nearly a decade. While platforms are not a replacement for full wetland conservation and restoration, they can be really helpful supplements. They can improve a site's ability to support breeding consistently despite annual fluctuations in nest material availability, and that can threaten this. So next I'll pass it over to Kylie to talk about our conservation action plan.
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, everyone. My name is Kylie McElrath. I'm a conservation manager with Audubon Great Lakes, and I'm excited to share our conservation action plan that we developed over the past year as a result of all of our previous monitoring efforts. The goals of this plan were to develop an inventory of black tern nesting sites across the state and to strategically guide habitat management efforts, including restoration and enhancement. We'll be sharing a link to a copy of our conservation action plan in our follow-up email, as well as a link to a story map about the conservation action plan. So be on the lookout for that in the next few days. We developed the plan around 5 focal sites across Michigan, including Portage Marsh State Wildlife Area, Muskong State Wildlife Management Area, Tawas Lake, Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area, and Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. These sites have known breeding colonies and relatively large populations of black terns. These sites are also where we wanted to gain a little bit more information about the habitat conservation needs for black terns. And we'll hear a bit more about some of the work at a few of these sites from our partners coming up. The data from our monitoring efforts, as Jenny mentioned, has helped us to better understand the threats facing the black terns at these sites. And some of the key threats that we documented include predation, weather and water level fluctuations, and general habitat loss or degradation. And in the conservation plan, we offered recommendations for habitat conservation that may address some of these threats and improve the breeding habitat for black terns. And some examples include the use of nesting platforms, which Jenny mentioned, and management of invasive species to offer more suitable nesting habitat. And some of our recommendations will benefit not only black terns, but also other wetland-dependent species and may improve the overall wetland health, which can in turn benefit people as well. We also hope that the information and recommendations in the plan can help inform conservation at other sites around the state and around the Great Lakes Basin as a whole. And now I'd like to pass it to Cameron Dole, who will talk about conservation efforts at one of our focal sites, Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kylie. And hello and welcome, everybody. It's impressive to see almost 200 of you the week of the 4th of July holiday, and I appreciate you taking the time. Again, I'm Cameron Dole, wildlife biologist with the Michigan DNR. Cover Bay and Saginaw County, and then this little blip of Aranac County, which is of highlight here. That's considered Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area. We've got 5,200 total acres of state managed land in this parcel, but just about 900 of it is highlighted in yellow there, in which it's been a really productive area for black terns, but as well as a bunch of other threatened and endangered species, including invertebrates, but also common vertebrates that you might more think of, like bald eagles, American and least bitterns, things like marsh wrens and yellow-headed blackbirds. And the point of this is that this critical habitat is one of the emphasis that we have on our management scope. And while we provide a lot of benefit for the black terns, and it's one of our management goals, it's a really great ecosystem service for all species, including humans upstream. The Rifle River actually channelizes and goes through that impoundment and down into the Lake Huron watershed there. To which, a lot of our management is maintaining those dikes and improving those wetlands. I had a great question from Chris Hansen, shout out for messaging in the group. We have a lot of cattail resurgence and abundance that's in there, and some of that is native cattail and some of it's non-native. But managing it to be more hemi-marsh-like, as Kylie said, where we have a 50-50 mixture between water and vegetation, whether that's lily pads or removing invasive, more noxious species like Phragmites, is important. And it's all showcased by this indicator species of the black tern, which really elicits the fact that we're doing a good job and we're making as good of improvements as we can on the area to sustain that colony into the future. And I think if we click to the next slide here, it'll highlight some of the things that we've done in more recent days. So 5,200 acres, we've got a little bit of southern hardwood swamp and lake plain prairie, as well as both emergent marsh and then Great Lakes coastal wetlands. Some of the things that we do, you see aerial herbicide work, selective herbicide to remove some of that 100% coverage of cattail in that bottom image and be selective to make sure that we're not removing it all. And then we can follow up with the picture on the right to burn some of that standing vegetation that will then open up the waterways afterwards. And then the masticator you see there is a fecund mower that we do to open our openings up in our adjacent hardwoods that helps other species more so than black terns, but then can help with insect populations based off of pollinator plot improvements and et cetera that can then spill over to those wetland related species. But all in all, it's an amazing place. If you're on the call and you're looking to enjoy some state managed lands, I would highly, highly recommend that you go to Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area. And we're proud and happy to continue to have conservation efforts to improve their habitat and their restoration moving forward. I think that's it from me. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I'm passing the torch to Joe Kaplan.
Yes, Cameron, thank you very much. My name's Joe Kaplan, and I am with a nonprofit group that does migratory bird research and conservation, focused on the Great Lakes, Common Coast Research and Conservation. I first started partnering with Audubon back in 2006 during the Important Bird Areas subcommittee or technical committee. And then after that, with Audubon's Great Lakes, looking at this black tern issue of a conservation dependent species, at least we believe so, that is in pretty drastic decline. Other conservation dependent species I work with are purple martins, which are at the northern periphery of the range in the UP, and also common loons. Black terns have proven to be one of the most difficult species I've studied in my 35 years of being a biologist. It feels like a more apt name for it would maybe be the Goldilocks tern, because it never seems like conditions are perfect for it. Either water levels are too low, water levels are too high, too wet, too dry. This first slide shows where I'm at the northern end of Lake Michigan, northern end of Green Bay, and the adjacent Bay Knox. There's two sites. Traditionally, Ogons Bay was a stronghold for black terns. In fact, when we did the first surveys, systematic surveys back in 2010, we had over 50 pairs of terns, black terns nesting in Ogons Bay in the Bay de Noc. And by the time we initiated actual research on them in 2015, we were down to 15 pairs. So really drastic decline. And then where I live, just south of Escanaba on the Portage Marsh, that was another site that when we started back in 2010 had 0 terns and didn't start coming online till 2010. And the best explanation for that is tied to Great Lakes water levels, especially Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, which is tied together. As Andy pointed out, a lot of fresh water, surface water of the world's supply is tied up in the Great Lakes. And I believe Lake Michigan has maybe 20% of the Great Lakes freshwater supply, so incredibly important to birds, to wildlife, and especially humans. I looked it up today. That's 1 quadrillion gallons. That's one followed by 15 zeros. And I point that out because if you look at the long-term average from about 1981 to 2020, you can see the rise and fall. And we still don't know what drives Great Lakes water levels. And if you think about the record low in 2013, which was really in the middle of our research period, to the record high levels in 2020, over that 7-year period, we saw a fluctuation of about 6 feet on the Great Lakes. And that's not a trivial amount of water for a lake that has 1 quadrillion gallons. What we have found in all our sites, what terns are really looking for is the interface again between open water and marsh and shoreline. In the lower right hand corner, that's what it looked like in Ogons Bay after 2017 when the entire area was scoured. And you can see the light line right next to the shoreline. That's all the bulrush that was deposited from the previous growing season. And the interface between that floating mat and water levels and the shoreline is what terns are focusing in as far as being able to have adequate structure for nesting dead floating debris when they return in May. If they don't find conditions right, they move on, and we still don't know where they move to, but there's a lot of flexibility within these terns. And so it wouldn't be a surprise at all or a stretch to think that birds associated with Portage Marsh easily could show up in Ogons Bay, just as easily maybe show up in Saskatchewan. Better tracking will probably give us a better idea of that. So from that 20,000 foot view, looking at stochastic events over time, there's a really important signature here with water when dealing with coastal marshes. Now, that's not the same thing on inland lakes, but unfortunately, there's been huge declines or significant declines of black terns on inland lakes, probably driven by the premium that humans put on lake shore and open water. So trying to find a protected bay with perfect conditions is becoming increasingly rare in a place like the UP that's only growing in popularity over time. Take next slide, please. So one of the things I did, well, this shows Ogons Bay. The insert there is my nephew Jack, who's now a junior at Michigan State University. He helped me in 2016 when we had 18 pairs of Black Terns, and you can see that is what that emergent marsh looked like in 2016 when 18 terns, 18 pairs of terns were nesting. You can see on the shoreline, the tree line of ash and a small white structure. That was the house. So when you think about the size of my nephew when he's about 12 years old, that's all about 3.5 feet of water. So when you think about a 6-foot fluctuation of a Great Lakes over that same period of time that we've been studying, that's a huge change for terns. That bottom slide was taken just 4 years later, and the difference in the water levels between 2016 and 2019 was just 2 feet. But it was enough to completely take out that emergent marsh. And in 2019, we were down to 0 pairs of Black Tern. Now, during that exact same time, over in Portage Marsh, there was quite that increase of water inundated the 600 acres of cattails that had been absent of water for almost a generation. So while the decline of Ogons was notable, the increase, reestablishment of Black Terns in the Portage Marsh was notable. They first established back in 2020, and what really enticed those birds to come back into the Portage Marsh was the previous in 2020 was on Thanksgiving weekend of 2019. There was a rare freeze event in Little Bay de Noc or Portage Bay that created ice very quickly, and then there was a water level shift that completely sheared off about 600 acres of cattail. So the next year that the Black Terns returned from their southern from the winter breeding areas, they established on the inner lagoon of the marsh, which is connected to the Great Lakes, rising water levels. It was a perfect scenario for those terns, and we've been trying to recreate that ever since. And it just hasn't been possible because from the high water levels of 2020, which were record high during the summer, we have now dropped 3 feet. So terns have moved back out into the bay and sort of that open hemi-marsh area of 50% water, 50% cattail, which seems to really work well for the birds, but is limited. Next slide, please. And also not looking just from an annual basis, but some of the camera imagery we did, in some of the larger sites where there's a lot of terns, going in and monitoring terns can be, the well-meaning biologists can have a negative effect as far as a disturbance effects. The tern colonies are very particular about letting intruders in, and of course they see people as predators or disturbance event, even though we're well-meaning. So that really drove trying to use technology to capture some of these bottleneck events to understand, one, reduce our impact of monitoring frequently, but also increase the ability to understand exactly why these nests are failing. And so much of our productivity in determining nest outcome was unknown. So we started working together on developing either time lapse or using trail cams and batteries and trying to figure out a way to monitor the nesting outcome during that 21 days of incubation. And then after 21 days of incubation, how long do they actually, those 3 chicks are tied to the nest site. And cameras gave us, I think, the best view into that. They reduce human disturbance, they collect rare events, they give us outcomes, they identify predators. And in the case of looking at what's happening on these coastal marshes, this is a great example. This is time lapse. So these cameras take an image about every 1 to 5 seconds. And there's a saying in Michigan, if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes. Well, look at the conditions that this particular tern pair experienced over, a 3-hour period. At 4:24, there was a torrential downpour. You can see that the adult somehow is still on the nest, incubating eggs, but it looks like it's almost underwater. And then at 6:23 p.m., the sun came out. Water levels go back down. You can see it sitting on its on the nest. And then at 7:43 p.m., that is the last image of the tern above water with its eggs gone. There was no images after this because the camera got completely inundated with water. It was placed about 2 feet above the level of the lake, and water inundated it and destroyed it. So over basically a 3-hour period, you see this nest fail. And it was interesting because in the exact same area, there was other terns that we were monitoring that had already hatched chicks. And we have images of those 3 chicks sort of riding up and down on these mats. So we have annual variation, and then we have these stochastic events that can have a huge impact. Next slide, please. So the idea is how to mitigate that. We're doing something basically adaptive management as we go along to try to understand, is there ways that we can take native or enhance nesting success. Something I've used for 2 decades to increase loon productivity are artificial nest platforms made out of PVC. Instead of 3 feet by 3 feet, these are 9 inches square. And there's been some success for this. But again, it really is more of a supplemental. You can see in that middle slide, there's a nest initiated on that small platform, and that will rise and fall with lake levels. Seiches, I should also explain that in that last slide, that sudden rise, that 2 feet rise and drop is called a seiche. A lot of people think that's tidal, but it really is with differential pressure across a large area. And then, of course, the what happens to chicks once they hatch. There's 21-day period of which the parents have to feed 3 chicks. So the longer they're retained at that nest site and protected, the easier it is for the chicks to be provisioned. And again, lower left-hand corner is what a typical tern nest looks like in the Portage Marsh or Ogons Bay. It seems very vulnerable, but that's what I would call just right. That's all the slides I have. Next up is Amy Bauer from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of the Chippewa Indians. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm Amy Bauer. I'm a wildlife biologist for the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. Today I'll be sharing a few lessons that we learned while monitoring black terns and how we're using that knowledge to support the colonies at Muskong Bay moving forward. So I'm going to start by painting a picture of our site. As you can see in the picture, Muskong State Wildlife Management Area is a real gem of the Upper Peninsula. It's massive with over 14,000 acres of wetland, much of it still undeveloped, and it offers promising habitat for black terns. Back in the 1950s, a 4-mile dike system was built here to support waterfowl hunting, and by the 1990s, that dike was breached and changed how water flows across the landscape. Since then, sediments and nutrients have built up, and the thick stands of invasive species like narrow-leaf cattail and reed canary, which have taken over a large part of the marsh. Despite the invasive species monocultures, black terns have still managed to find a foothold here. They usually nest along the rough edges in the cattail beds where the floating mats form. While the habitat isn't perfect, it's still big and diverse enough to support them. If you could go to the next slide. So monitoring the black tern nest in Muskong has been both challenging and a good learning experience. We've had a lot of similar issues to what Joe just talked about, so hopefully this isn't too redundant. Wetlands like Muskong are dynamic by nature, with water levels shifting from seiche events, storms, winds, and even ship traffic from the St. Mary's shipping channel. These changes happen really fast in Muskong. They can reshape those vegetation zones practically overnight. And as mentioned before, we were monitoring the nest with the motion activated cameras, which led to some struggles. So the huge differences in the water level shifting made it hard to keep the nest in the frame. And a strong northwest wind blows into Muskong and can change that water level by a foot, which happens pretty frequently and causes the camera to refocus on the cattail swaying in the waves instead of the actual nest. A huge issue we had was that constant movement drained the batteries way faster than we had anticipated, and some batteries only survived a few days during that time lapse, and due to that, we did lose a lot of good footage. Despite all of that, we did still get some important insight beyond population sizes. One interesting pattern we saw was black terns change their nesting spots over time. Before 2022, most of them nested inside the old dike system, and since then we see them shift further out into the bay. We speculate that this is tied to the rising and dropping of the water levels, which makes some areas more vulnerable to predators like raccoons. The black terns responded by moving to areas less accessible by land. Moving forward, we hope to refine our camera setups for the next season, which that means more staff time to check cameras and batteries, experimenting with different mounting options and learning from what's worked at other sites with the goal to get better data to understand the threats to those colonies and figure out ways to reduce those threats. We're also following a key recommendation from the Audubon Great Lakes Conservation Action Plan, which is to deploy floating nest platforms with built-in predator deterrence, which will give black terns a safer, more stable place to nest, especially in exposed areas of the bay, and will hopefully create more nesting choices. Long-term, we're also working on habitat restoration. So right now, much of the marsh is dense cattail monocultures, which isn't optimal habitat. We're planning to open up small pockets in those areas to create better shelter from wind and waves that can break apart the fragile vegetation mats that the terns depend on. We'll be doing this mechanically using aquatic weed cutters, first on a smaller scale, and we'll also be timing it for later in the summer after the terns have left to avoid disturbing the nesting season. And in those newly cleared areas, we'll reestablish native bulrush, which is a good, robust native vegetation for black tern nesting, and will hopefully get us closer to that desired 50-50 hemi-marsh that black tern thrive in. In these same areas, we're also excited to reintroduce monomen, which is also known as wild rice. Monomen is important to the tribe both ecologically and culturally. It's a nutritious food source for wildlife and humans alike. A lot of the marsh birds use it as a prime food source. Beyond that, it gives valuable cover, provides awesome nesting opportunities, stabilizes wetlands, and buffers wind. It also improves like water quality. So we're interested to see how those rice beds will influence the tern populations and how that reintroduction shifts habitat use. Of course, to track that, we need to continue doing good monitoring. So we've been doing shoreline surveys for 5 years to collect data on black tern populations. And these surveys help us see long-term trends and give us a baseline to measure whether our restoration efforts are making a difference and how they're making those differences. And it's really important to keep all of this monitoring up because, as Joe mentioned, black terns are sensitive. They don't tolerate a lot of disturbance, and if the conditions aren't quite right, they'll abandon a site. So we want to know exactly where they are and how they're doing. It's key for understanding how they respond to actions we're taking, from restoration to deploying those nesting platforms. Muskong Bay really is a special place for the terns since it's so large and relatively intact and full of potential for black terns. It gives us a rare opportunity, which is to scale up what's been learned at smaller sites and apply it across a much bigger landscape. It's a good opportunity to refine strategies, test new tools, and really understand what it takes to support black tern colonies in a dynamic, changing wetland. With the right strategies, partnerships, and community support, we believe that we can turn that potential into long-lasting conservation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kylie.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you to Cameron and Joe as well for sharing. As you've just heard, our next steps following the development of the Conservation Action Plan are to actually implement the recommendations from the plan and our lessons learned, including continued monitoring efforts and habitat management. And we look forward to continued collaboration with our partners to make this happen. One of the focal sites that we did not get to touch on today is Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, which is such a large site that we hope to do more monitoring there and to really better understand all of the areas within that site that the terns are using and get a better understanding of the threats that they're facing there. And not only is it a very large 10,000 acre national wildlife refuge, it's adjacent to the 10,000 acre Shiawassee State Game Area. And Jenny and I were just out there with Cameron, as you can see in this picture, last Monday to do some scouting of the site for black terns and get an idea of where across the state game area they might be using so that we can focus some future monitoring efforts. And despite the blazing heat out there that day, we did witness many active black terns, so that was super exciting. And one of the other focal sites that we did not get to touch on today was Tawas Lake, which is very unique because it's home to the state's largest minnow bed, and the terns are actually using it for nesting there. So we intend to continue our monitoring efforts there, as well as outreach and education with the public around the ecological and cultural significance of the site. And next slide. So overall, we've learned through the development of this conservation action plan that targeted management is needed at key black tern sites. Not all of these black tern colonies are facing the same challenges or to the same degree, and we need to understand where and how to apply our conservation efforts to maximize our impact. And additionally, ongoing monitoring is critical to guide effective site-specific wetland management, and collaboration with collaboration and community engagement are essential to conservation of wetlands and to support black tern conservation. And next. So how can you help? There are many ways that you can get involved and to help support black terns and conservation efforts, including supporting your local conservation organizations. You can continue to stay in touch with us and involved in our programs, such as the upcoming My Birds Pawpaw River State Game Area webinar that will be on July 17th, I believe. We can send that in the follow-up email as well. You can also volunteer to be a community scientist or steward at your local public lands. This also includes submitting your eBird reports. If you are out birding and you happen to see black terns or other cool species, recording them on eBird is a great way to help support the work that we do. As we've heard today, we have used eBird data for efforts such as this conservation action plan. And any advocacy work for our wetlands is critical. Continued support for funding streams to support these efforts is really key to making this work happen. And next. And with the upcoming holiday, we also just want to share some reminders about recreating with care. Our black terns and other birds and wildlife will likely experience a degree of stress with heavy recreation traffic and fireworks. So any measures that you can take to reduce the stress on them will make a difference. And this can include keeping a distance from nests and birds, staying on designated trails and boat routes, and also avoiding, if you're on a watercraft, avoiding those vegetated areas where birds like the black terns might be nesting. Respect any signage in closed areas, and minimize any noise such as fireworks. And it's important to share this reminder with others that you might be recreating with or nearby as well. So thank you all so much for joining us for our program today. And now we have a little bit of time for some questions that you might have.
Thank you to all of our presenters and everyone for joining us today. I've seen in the Q&A that many of the questions that have come through have been answered, but I think some are still worth lifting up. And I saw questions come in a few different buckets. So one is on impacts to black tern population, primarily around predators. And so some folks asked, are there any knowledge of mute swans impacting black tern breeding or even great blue heron? And so I want to open that up to the panelists for anyone to jump in, maybe just generally speaking, to talk about other birds that might be predators to the black tern.
Well, for sure, mute swans, because they'll get into black tern habitat and build nests, and they're fairly aggressive. That was a problem early on in Ogons Bay. but the USDA and the state of Wisconsin did quite a bit of mute swan management out on the lake, and that really.
Thanks, Joe. I think you cut out a little bit at the end, but thank you. We also had a question on invasive species. Opening to the group, are there any native cattail species?
Yeah, and I think Cameron touched on this, but yeah, for the group, so our invasive cattail is narrow-leaf cattail. That's the one that is forming these dense monocultures. But narrow-leaf cattail can also hybridize with our native broadleaf cattail. So hybrid cattail and narrow-leaf cattail are the ones that we are concerned about with invasion. But we do still see broadleaf cattail in some areas, and that's the desired species of cattail to that will not form these dense monocultures that will take over the wetland habitats. So yes, again, the cattail species that we are conducting management for is the narrowleaf and the hybrid cattails or the invasives, in addition to invasive common reed or Phragmites.
Yeah, I would add
Thanks,
that just
Kylie.
interestingly,
Go ahead.
the cattail has a completely different growth form out towards the edge of the water, where it really provides a nice interspersion with the water. And that the non-native cattail just doesn't do that. It's very dense, and it actually grows so dense that some of the secretive marsh birds have a tough time pushing through it and finding good foraging habitat.
Thanks, Andy. We had a question on insect declines and if that might be impacting black terns. Open it up to the group.
So I will defer to Jenny and some of the other experts and maybe Stephanie on black terns on this, but we do know that insectivores as a group of birds are in decline, in steep decline. Species like chimney swifts and other birds that depend on insects for forage are in decline. So it would stand to reason that any species that's heavily dependent on the use of insects would be impacted by that. I think black tern have a little bit more varied diet in what they can consume, and Jenny can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if there's direct impacts from the decline of insects.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and one that definitely merits some further study, because we don't have much study specifically on black terns looking at insect declines, but there have been other studies with other insectivores that have been impacted by that. So yeah, it's a great question.
We had a question about hemi-marsh and how many acres of hemi-marsh is required for black terns to breed. And I just asked that whoever takes this one explains a little bit about hemi-marsh or re-explains a little bit about hemi-marsh, because we can never say enough about how important it is for birds.
Well, I'll start out with the explanation of hemi-marsh, and then someone else could chime in with the exact acreage for a pair of nesting black tern. But we do know, so hemi-marsh, it literally translates into half marsh, right? Hemi, being Latin for half, indicates that we want a configuration of vegetation and water in approximately a 50-50 ratio. So this is kind of where all the action is for secretive marsh birds. This is where there's really high quality forage because they can interact with the water while staying propped up on the vegetation. They can also seek cover from predation by hiding in that vegetation. Oftentimes this is emergent vegetation, so they're far enough from the land where land predators aren't easily able to access them. So this is really important habitat for a whole suite of birds, not just black tern. We do know black tern like to nest out on the edge of these large hemi-marsh, so where they're a little bit more protected from predators, and we often see black terns in very large marshes with good edge hemi-marsh.
Thanks, Andy.
I
We
can
have a
speak to
question. Do
this.
black terns? Oh, go ahead.
So sorry, was there a question too about the acreage?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry.
So for a colony, I would say what I've seen from All About Birds is the minimum acreage is about 50 hectares, but that's for a colony. I don't know what the exact size would be for one nest or one nesting pair.
Thanks, Jenny. We have a question. Do black tern chicks usually fledge before wild rice harvest time?
Jenny,
And we
maybe
can
you're
just
able
open
to,
up to the group. Yeah, go ahead, Kylie.
maybe Jenny can speak to the fledging time, and then Amy, can you speak to wild rice harvest, the Monoman harvest time?
Yeah, the fledging timing is usually at the end of July, sometimes into August, but typically they start to leave their nesting site by August. So I believe if wild rice comes after that, I feel like it's in the fall, but Amy can speak more to that.
Yeah, the wild rice is actually ready to harvest in the fall. In July, it's at the floating stage, and then as it gets to August, it's standing but not quite ready to harvest. So it does still provide valuable protection.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for a couple more questions. One I wanted to highlight was we had a question about our conservation work in St. Clair Flats, or work to protect the black tern in St. Clair Flats. Kylie, I might turn that one to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, St. Clair Flats is still a site where we are collaborating with the DNR as well as Detroit Bird Alliance to continue black tern work there. We did not include it in this conservation action plan or in today's webinar because of the vast amount of work and research that has been done at that site. Again, the sites that we included in this conservation action plan are ones where we felt we had a little bit more gap in our understanding of the conservation needs. So we're still doing work at St. Clair Flats, and we're continuing partnerships with the DNR. Detroit Bird Alliance is doing a lot of great monitoring work, and are going to be continuing the use of nesting platform work there. And we're looking to do some habitat restoration work there, in partnership with the DNR and with Ducks Unlimited there.
Thank you, Kylie. As our last question, we have, and thank you so much again to all the panelists who answered questions and to our participants for sending them in. Are there theories or studies on causes of water fluctuations?
So we know, obviously, water fluctuation in the Great Lakes is largely driven by rainfall events and runoff from rainfall events and snowmelt. That being said, Lake Ontario has been artificially managed over the last 50 years. The Robert Moses Dam prevents the level from being fluctuated too far out of a set parameter. That has changed within the last couple of years to reflect, instead of a static water level, a more natural dynamic, which is hopefully going to improve the health of our heavy marshes on Lake Ontario. In dry years and in cycles where we don't have as much rainfall, obviously the Great Lakes water level drops. So those are usually the main drivers of water levels in the Great Lakes. There are places where there are impoundments where the water level is actively managed on wildlife management areas and other. And in those sites, we have a little bit more control over managing the water level, which can be a main driver of interspersion of vegetation to water, and also controlling some of those invasives without the need for herbicide. There are situations where that's a challenge for fish passage. So we're always working to try to create a more harmonic, holistic management strategy around water level management.
And I'll just add that these intra and inter-annual water level fluctuations are natural. We do see these fluctuating periods of high water level years and low water level years. However, with climate change, we are seeing more drastic fluctuations. We're reaching extreme highs and extreme lows in these water level fluctuation cycles.
All right, thank you again so much for everyone for answering questions and submitting them. I'll turn it over to Andy or Kylie to close us out.
Go ahead, Kylie.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining. Huge thank you to all of our partners for joining us today. It was really great to hear from you and the work that you're accomplishing on the ground at your sites. And we look forward to hearing more from all of you. And we look forward to all of the participants joining us for our next upcoming webinars. And please have a great and safe holiday week.